a difference a couple hours makes. It's hard to believe it's the same body of water out there. We're just off the starboard side over here on our right. We're just starting to pass Anacostia Island now. It's one of the largest islands in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It's a provincial nature reserve with a very, very small community, Port-Mercier. So it's giving us some shelter from those winds now. And then just over the horizon on the other side is the Gaspé Peninsula. So we're in a narrower stretch now, and that, accompanied with the diminishing of the winds, has really made a difference, I think. So hopefully smooth sailing for tonight. So thank you for joining me this evening. I know it's not the best topic for a cruise ship, but it's something I really enjoy talking about and reading about. I grew up on the Great Lakes. My grandfather was very passionate about the lakes and its ships. His father, my great-grandfather, worked on the Lakers, as they're called, the freighters on the lakes. And my grandfather had quite the collection of shipwreck books about the Great Lakes that I used to enjoy looking at when I went over to visit. I ended up purchasing their cottage when my grandmother passed away, and so I inherited his whole collection of Great Lakes shipwreck books. And have since expanded to an interest in shipwrecks from around the world. But I want to keep this, it's going to be really depressing, but my message all the way along is how we learn as we go along, and sadly all these tragedies which took so many lives and affected so many people, at the same time they also help us to learn the things that we learned so that we do feel safer when we travel by water today. And I promise to leave you with a very positive statistic about traveling by ocean, so keep that in mind before you leave early. So we're not going to really be talking about this night tonight, because there's lots of places we can find out information about the Titanic, of course, which of course sunk on its maiden voyage in 1912. So well known because it was at the time the largest ship. It was the fastest ship. It also had a lot of famous people on it when it first sailed, and quite a few of them died. And nothing makes a good story than rich people dying, because that's really what it's just, the newspapers just ate it up. Now, of course, the first piece of information that came in were lots of disparaging information, and so it wasn't until much later that we knew exactly what happened, how over 1,500 people died in the tragedy, how poorly it was managed in some ways, and how unprepared they were for that kind of tragedy. It started to fade a little bit from collective memory until Walter Lord's book in 1955, A Night to Remember, became an instant bestseller, and that, of course, was followed as well by a movie in 1958, and that really helped keep the Titanic in the limelight. For me, there's a guy that wrote these adventure books, Clive Cussler, and I saw the very bad movie of this when I was, I think, 12 years old, but then went home and read the book and loved the book and read many of his books after that. And so that was the start of my transition from being really interested in just Great Lakes shipwrecks to other kinds of shipwrecks as well. And of course, Robert Ballard's discovery in 1985 of the wreck of the Titanic. Of course, many of us know that at the time he was tasked on a secret mission by the US government to be looking for the two submarines, the Scorpion and the Thresher, and whatever time was left over after that, he was given permission to look for the Titanic. So it's thanks to the US Navy and that secret mission that we did eventually find the Titanic. But of course, for our millennials out there, the younger generations today, this is what they think of when they hear about the Titanic, a movie that took years to make, that cost a lot of money to make, but ended up being such a huge, huge hit. I always smile when I think of the first time I saw the movie in theaters when it came out, but then the first time I rented the movie, and then back then when you went and you got your VHS, on the back it gave you all the warnings of it. So it said some sexual content, minor swearing, one man gets shot, 1,500 people die. That was that was the parental warning on the back of it. So. Now, what the Titanic did, though, is it helped to lead the creation of something that you've heard about when you first got onto the ship during our crew drill, and that's SOLAS, or Safety of Life at Sea. So there were two inquiries after the Titanic sunk, an American inquiry and a British inquiry. And one of the main things came out were some of the shortcomings, especially when it came to safety equipment on the ship, when it came to, of course, the number of lifeboats, which is one of the things people talk about the most, and radio communication. So with the publication of the British report, that turned into a call for all nations to work together to develop something called safety of life at sea, to ensure that there is enough life jackets and lifeboats for every single person on board, to ensure that radio rooms are being monitored 24 hours a day, to ensure that there is some training for the crew. So Great Britain was one of the countries that ratified SOLAS, but unfortunately not enough countries had ratified it before World War I broke out. So it wasn't until the 1920s that SOLAS was formally ratified by enough countries to come into force. It was completely redone in the 1940s as well, and as we'll see near the end of this, it continues to be a major part, of course, of cruising to this day. So as we go through this, we'll take a look at how safety has been impacted by some of these. Some of these are ones that I've just always been interested in. Some of them are just so sort of out of the blue or just so unique that they deserve mention, and some of them are really important to the development of safety. Now, each one of these stories I tell could be a complete lecture in itself. Some of them could be multiple lectures. So I'm going to frustrate some of you out there because I'm not going to give you enough information at all, because I'm just going to sort of touch the surface. But I want to take a look very quickly at two that happened before the Titanic, and one of them was with the General Slocum, which was a ship named after a Civil War general who later became a congressman, and this took place in June of 1904. The ship had been built in 1891, and that's important for me to remember the date it was built because of what happened a little bit later here. And on this date, it was actually hired by St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which was a very predominantly German-speaking area, and the church was the cornerstone of the community. And every year, they hired a ship to take the congregation out on a picnic. And so on this day, it was loaded mostly with women and children. There was only 120 men above the age of 21 as passengers on the vessel. But unfortunately, it went up the East River, and then it made the turn out into the Long Island Sound. And unfortunately, a small fire broke out near the bow of the ship. Because these ships were not only just made of wood, but they were often lacquered heavily to make them look very shiny, the fire spread towards the stern pretty quickly. So what the captain did was he made the decision to beach the ship. Felt it would be easier to fight the fire if they were beached. But unfortunately, the way he turned to beach the ship put them right into the wind and basically just drove the waves all the way backwards. But what this did was it allowed us to take a look for the first time at some basic safety equipment, and that was life preservers. So the ship did end up tilted over on its side, completely burned. It was a side wheeler. And as people were putting on life jackets, because very few people knew how to swim then, and of course it was a picnic, which means they were all wearing heavy clothes, dresses, and things like that. So as they put on their life jackets and jumped into the water, they found that the life jackets caused them to actually sink. And that's because the life jackets had been sitting out in the open since 1891 when the ship was built. Most of them simply disintegrated. Some of the life jackets they found afterwards, the life jackets, the way they were inspected at the time was they were inspected by weight. So they had to weigh like 400 grams prove that they had 400 grams of cork material in it. Cork was quite expensive, so they actually took little pieces of iron and put it in there to make them heavier, but not have enough cork in it. So you can imagine, you put on one of these things, jump in the water. The fire safety equipment was also the original fire safety equipment, which had not been changed or anything done to it, often out exposed onto the deck since 1891. So 955 people died out of a total of about 1,400. Only 2 of them were crew members. The rest of them were all people that were aboard. So we learned a little bit about life jacket safety from that one. The Norge I just put in as an example of the many, many ships that made that trip across the Atlantic, bringing immigrants over that never made it. The Norge was one of those. It left Copenhagen in 1904 with a mostly Scandinavian and Russian manifest list, and almost all of them immigrants planning to move to the New World. So you had a combination of languages on board and absolutely no information given to the guests beforehand about any safety procedures. So when the ship hit a reef off the coast of the United Kingdom, there was very little organizational work done by the crew at all, and the passengers were mostly left to fend for themselves. And again, out of about a total of about 800 people, more than 600 people died on that. And there were many other ships like that in the early 20th century bringing immigrants aboard. You know, the fancy ships like the Titanic, the Lusitania that we'll talk about, the Olympic, all of those ships, they had these beautiful first-class cabins which cost a lot of money, but what really made the money on these ships were the third or steerage class, the number of immigrants that they were able to pack into those ships. So immediately after Titanic, and I'm really glad I got to do this lecture tonight, because the Empress of Ireland is one that even a lot of Canadians don't know about. But it happened, probably historically, because it was just a couple of months before the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand and the start of World War I later on in 1914, that we don't know as much about this one to its day. It was one of the two ships that was owned by the Canadian Pacific Railway Company. You're going to see an example of the hotels that the Canadian Pacific Railway Company built when we get to Quebec City. The other one was the Empress of Britain. And these ships were built, like I just mentioned, to bring immigrants over to Canada, integrated with their rail system. So they got off in Montreal or Halifax, and then they took rails out to Western Canada, where Canadian Pacific Company owned land. And what they sold that land to the people, and then those people started to raise crops, and they put their crops on the Canadian Pacific trains to bring them to port. So it was a very integrated system. So in May of 1914, this beautiful ship, which was about 580 feet long, it was making the voyage from Montreal to Liverpool, regular run for it, where it encountered heavy fog off in the St. Lawrence River close to Rimouski. We'll be passing by there sometime tomorrow night. The ship ended up running into another ship, a Norwegian coal ship called the Sorsad. The Empress of Ireland had a working radio on board, but at that time, only cruise ships had to under SOLAS. Regular ships like this did not, so there was absolutely no communication between the two vessels. This happened at about 1 o'clock in the morning, and as the captain of the Empress of Ireland tried through a megaphone to tell the Storsad not to back away once it crashed into it, so kind of keep the hole plugged for as long as possible, they didn't understand, and they backed away. The Empress of Ireland did have enough life jackets for everyone, did have enough lifeboats for everyone, had showed all the passengers how to use a life jacket before they got on. But with the size of the hole made by the Storsad, it was a Norwegian ship, so it had a nice reinforced hull and bow for getting through icy conditions. The Empress of Ireland sunk in 14 minutes, start to finish. 1,012 people died on that, and in fact, 4 more passengers died on the Empress of Ireland than died on the Titanic. It's just so many people died in the Titanic because it had such a huge crew and so many members of the crew died. But it was actually more paying people died on the Empress of Ireland, and it rests at the bottom of the St. Lawrence River in a couple hundred feet of water to this day. Now, this is one that I've known since I was a boy because this one happened on the Great Lakes. The Eastland happened in Chicago in 1915. There was a company in Chicago that had about 9,000 employees, and the last Saturday of every July, they had a picnic in Michigan City. So they rented 5 ferry boats to bring all of their employees and their families to this family day picnic. The Eastland was scheduled to be the first boat to leave at 7:30 in the morning. And at the time, Coast Guard inspections were a little relaxed. The Coast Guard was not a fully, really organized entity yet at that time. And the Eastland had had a lot of modifications done to the ship, but every time it was inspected, instead of actually putting down some of their passenger maximums they were allowed to have, they actually kept increasing it, even though they had done modifications to make it a little more tippy. So, and as people were loading the Eastland that day, they were only counted if they were counted by how they paid. So if you were an adult, you paid full fare, you were counted. If you were a teenager or an older child, you paid half fare, so you were counted as a half a person. If you were a child, you weren't counted at all. And if you were a member of the crew, or if you were someone going to work at Michigan City, because a lot of people were coming along to set up booths and things like that, you weren't counted at all. So they estimate by about 10 after 7 in the morning, they had about 2,500 people in total on board of this boat, way overloaded. And as this was in the Chicago River at the Clark Street Bridge near, and many of the people were going over to the other side to watch a ship pass. And it caused the ship to list to one side. Captain tried to use ballast to compensate for it and compensated too much, and it flipped over the other way. Almost everyone that was on that ship was a family member. Some family members lost 20, 25 extended members of their family at the time. And on that day, 865 people died. Again, more passengers died on that than died on the Titanic. And unless you're from the Chicago area, and even people sometimes from the Chicago area, very few people know about the Eastland. There's 2 memorials now, one at a cemetery and one at the bridge near Clark Street. And I just want to mention this one real quick, too, as another example of things that just can go wrong. And this is the Princess Sophia, and it ran the inside passage. So if you've ever taken a cruise out of Seattle or Vancouver up to Alaska, you've cruised the inside passage. Well, the Princess Sophia was one of the CPR ships on the Pacific side. There were 4 of them, and they all did that inside passage route, up from Skagway down to Vancouver. So in 1918, the Sophia left Skagway and was making its way down. After about 4 hours, it was just north of now Juneau, Alaska, when it hit the Vanderbilt Reef, which was a very not well-marked reef. It ended up actually stuck on top of the reef because it hit it at high tide. It couldn't get off, and then the tide went down. At one point, there were 8 rescue boats around the Sophia, but it was too difficult with the tides, with the reef, and with the weather to actually launch any rescue boats to get close enough, and the Sophia was not able to launch any of theirs. So on the afternoon of the 25th, those boats, the weather got worse, those boats had to leave, and it was the captain of the Sophia that told them to leave for their own safety. Those ships went back to port. They received a distress call just about 5 o'clock that evening, saying that the ship had twisted on the reef. And so all the ships ran back. They were there shortly after 6 o'clock, and there was no evidence of the ship whatsoever. It had fallen off the reef. Later on, when they found some bodies, all of the clocks had stopped at 5:50. So so it was less than an hour between that distress signal and the ship going down. And all the members of the crew and passengers died on that ship. So the Lusitania is one that a lot of people know, so I thought it was important to include that. I'm really focusing, except for one ship, I'm focusing on civilian ships, so not military wrecks during wartime, except for one. But the Lusitania is a special case because it was a passenger ship. It was bringing passengers to Europe at the time from New York. It was mostly British and Canadian that were on board, but there were about 160 Americans on board as well. And in May 1915, as it was just off the coast of Ireland, it was hit by torpedoes from U-20, one of the German submarines from World War I. The first one caused some damage to the ship. The second torpedo caused a very major explosion, so some people to this day believe that that was transporting ammunition, which the Germans believe, which according to rules of war would make it fair game. Again, it was the quickness of the sinking. Because of that second explosion, it caused a huge hole in the side of the ship, and it sunk within 18 minutes. As a result, almost 1,200 people died on it, and it was actually thanks to the bravery of the fishermen of the coastal communities in Ireland that came out. This happened at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That came out to help with those passengers that had been thrown off of the ship that were in some of the lifeboats that were able to be launched. There was only, I think, 6 lifeboats that were able to be launched, that even more lives weren't lost. Now, if you want to know more about this, I do every time that I can promote Eric Larson's books, I always do. He wrote another book called Devil in the White City about the World Exposition of 1893, but he wrote an excellent book called Dead Wake about the Lusitania. He wrote it from different viewpoints, too, including the captain of the German submarine, and that reminded me a little bit of Das Boot, if you ever saw that movie from the early 1980s, where by the end of the movie you actually end up rooting for the Germans because they just seem so human, and that's what that's how we're manipulated sometimes by our media. But this one gives a really nice balanced viewpoint from different points of view. So I would suggest that one as well. So after World War II, like I said, we got some better, that's when SOLAS was rewritten, and we got even better and better at making sure that people were safe at sea. But unfortunately, there was a couple of other tragedies that helped to improve that safety. And one of them was one called the Noronic, which is, again, a Great Lakes one, like the Eastland. This was a passenger ship that sailed from Duluth through all of Superior, down into Lake Huron, and sometimes into Lake Ontario to Toronto. And then Toronto is where it found itself on the night of the 17th of September. It was pulled up at the docks for the night. Most of the guests were staying on board. A few had gone into town, but many of the crew went into town because it was kind of, they're in port. It was kind of their night off. At very late at night, there was a passenger walking down a passageway, and he thought he smelled smoke. So he asked a crew member about it, and they traced it to a door, and they opened the door, and there was a fire probably caused by a discarded cigarette in this small linen closet. And as soon as they opened the door, they introduced new oxygen into it, and it just caused an explosion of flames to come out into the hallway. Again, it was a beautiful wooden ship that had been lacquered and polished many, many, many times. So a fire quickly spread throughout the entire ship. And at the end of that fire, once it was finally put out, because there was hardly any crew on board to deal with it, 118 people died. So I bring this one up because of incidents like this, we now have a system called import manning. And sometimes you might see, as you leave our ship, you'll see an IPM, and then you'll see a rectangle with a little color on it. So this is my safety card. Every member of our crew has a safety card on it. And on one side of our safety card, we have a little IPM in a different color. Mine's blue. And that means any day that we're blue, I have to stay on the ship all day. The only time I'm excused to go on the ship if I'm escorting a tour, because I'm part of the expedition team. But there are some of us that we're going to be getting to Quebec, we're going to come back all evening, you can go out, maybe do a little shopping or something like that. Nope. When your IPM color comes up, you stay on the ship so that we have a minimum number of people from different departments doing different duties so that we make sure that we're covered on the ship. In the 1950s, even in the 1950s, a lot of decisions about weather were made by the captain himself. Captains were very good at reading the weather, but this wasn't the case in what happened in Japan. The Toya Mayu was a ferry that made the 4.5-hour run between the islands of Hokkaido and Honshu. And on the September of 1954, there was a typhoon in the area, which caused the delay of the ship leaving and ultimately its cancellation. It was canceled leaving in the afternoon, but at about 5 o'clock, the weather started to clear up, and the captain and other captains took that as a sign that the storm was dissipating, when in fact the storm had slowed down and was actually gathering strength. So they left at about 6 o'clock to make their 4 or 5-hour passage over. They were only 20 minutes away from the dock when the storm just exploded again. So the captain dropped anchor. However, the storm was so strong, the typhoon was so strong that it broke the anchor line, and there was some flooding in the engine room. They could not get the engines restarted, and the ship started to drift. It drifted towards shore. It was actually about 300 meters, 300 yards away from shore when it flipped over onto its side and then eventually capsized. It was a horrific accident. There was actually 4 other ferries that also either sunk or had damage that day. On this ship alone, almost 1,200 people died, so very, very few survived this one, and almost 200 more died on those other 4 ferries. So after that, Japan and other countries started to put a lot more effort into meteorological forecasting in order to help ships out. In fact, the origins of the National Weather Service in the United States comes from a series of storms that happened on the Great Lakes in 1881 and 1882, which led to sea captains saying, we need some help, we need some support here. And they created a system of 24 stations that sent daily telegraph reports to Washington, D.C. And that was the birth of the National Weather Service. And so it was incidents like this into the 1950s that said we can't just rely on captains and their common knowledge anymore. And then going back to fire for a moment, we have the case of the Yarmouth Castle. The Yarmouth Castle was a ship that made regular runs between Miami and the Bahamas. And on the 12th of November of 1965, again, a fire broke out on the ship, and the crew did not really deal with it. There were some crew members that were absolutely heroic, that did everything they could to put out the fire, but most of the officers, including the captain, jumped into a lifeboat and left the ship. According to the captain, he was going to get help. there was no other ships nearby that within sight, so that wasn't really a great idea. But the Yarmouth Castle, because of the Yarmouth Castle, which caught on fire and caused 90 people to die, that is when we got into regular fire training for crew, required fire training. And the crew, I can tell you, nobody trains harder on this ship than the fire teams. And most of our drills that we have always are simulated fire somewhere in the ship. And the amount of work they have to do every drill day, because they get all the equipment out, they simulate smoke and all sorts of other things to make sure. Fire suppression systems were also required after the Yarmouth Castle. My connection with the Yarmouth Castle is I'm also, of course, interested in the Great Lakes ones, which, of course, includes Edmund Fitzgerald. Gordon Lightfoot's one of my favorite singers, and he actually wrote a ballad called The Ballad of Yarmouth Castle almost a decade before he wrote The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. So if you like Gordon Lightfoot, and if you haven't heard The Ballad of the Yarmouth Castle, you might want to check that one out. The greatest peacetime tragedy that ever has happened involved this ship in the Philippines in 1987. It was during the Christmas season. This was a ferry that was making runs to Manila from various islands. And from where it started that year, it was about a 24-hour run into Manila. Now, the ship had been built in the early 1960s in Japan. And in Japan, it was certified to take up to just under 600 passengers. In the Philippines, it was certified to take up to 1,400 passengers. With no modifications made. It actually had a previous name, but they had a fire that was quite well publicized in 1979. So after it was retrofitted, they changed the name to Doña Paz. So anyways, it started its voyage on the 19th of December. And when the way it worked in the Philippines at the time was the number of people on board was based on the number of paying people. But once the paying people boarded, very often people that paid extra directly to the crew were allowed to come on board. So it left from its first port with way more people than it was supposed to have, many more people, went to its second port and did the same thing again. And of course, none of those people were listed on the manifest as well. So that night on the Doña Paz, of course, it's during the Christmas season. People are celebrating, including some of the crew, including the officers. And it turns out that on the bridge that night, there was one assistant mate running the ship who was fairly newly hired. Most of the officers were having a party. By some reports, the captain of the ship was trying out his new Betamax, watching a movie in his cabin. Now, it was a calm night, and it wasn't foggy or anything, but we have a very inexperienced person on the ship here. And then we have another ship out at the same time called the Vector. It was a tanker ship carrying about 1 million liters of gasoline with no lookouts. It didn't have anyone doing any lookouts. And the two ships did see each other, but they didn't read each other's lights properly, and they ended up colliding, one ship into the other. And of course, the Vector caught on fire. Those 1 million liters of gasoline went into the ocean, and the Doña Paz just became a fireball. And what's even worse is those that were able to jump off into the water actually started to boil because the fire was so absolutely intense. They only recovered a couple of hundred bodies from there, so memorial gardens, because there's only, and that's the thing about shipwrecks too, right? Especially if you can't recover the bodies, it's just, people need that place to go and to grieve, and so there is memorial gardens outside of Manila now. It was a horrific accident. At first, the company said that there was about 1,400 passengers on board, so they were sort of right within their limits as far as what they were supposed to have. That was later up to 1,500, and later they admitted that they had about 1,800 people on board. It actually took a newspaper that asked for people to send in the names of people that were missing, that were suspected to have been on board. And quite a few months went by until the full number was released. 4,500 people were estimated to be on that ship. 26 survived from this ship, and 2 survived from the Vector, for a total of 28 survivors from this. This company already did not have a good reputation, and the reputation went even more downhill. The following October, less than a year, one of its sister ship, the Doña Marilyn, got caught in a typhoon, and again, about half of the people on board died. Now, into the 1990s, we get really cruise ships are looking safer and safer generally, but ferry ships continue to be a problem. They're often very shallow, so they're a little bit more unstable. They have different ways of getting vehicles on and off the ship. The Salem Express, for example, was known as a roll-on, roll-off ship, RORO, where the bow opens up, they can just roll on, roll off, and it was making a shortcut from Saudi Arabia over to Suez across the Red Sea and hit a coral reef. 650 people died out of 830. They were found to be not following most of the SOLAS rules. So if they had been following the SOLAS rules, they estimate that only perhaps 100 to 200 people might have died on that ferry. Because I've talked a couple of times about my Great Lakes, the North American Great Lakes, I'll mention one from the African Great Lakes, and that's Lake Victoria. The Bukoba was a ferry that sank in 1996. They still to this day are not quite sure what caused it to sink. And they're also not sure to this day how many people were even on the ship. They have absolutely no idea, but they estimate it was about 1,000 and only about 100 people survived, but they have no idea to this day. But when it comes to ferries, probably the most well-known one was the Estonia, which happened in 1994. The ship was really the pride of the newly independent nation of Estonia. It was making its run from Tallinn to Stockholm. Most of the people on board were either Swedish or from Estonia. And in this case, it had the same kind of contraption that the other ship had over here, but it had some upgrades done to make sure that it closed properly and that if it wasn't closed properly, alarms would go off. But unfortunately, a latch let go that didn't cause the alarm to go off, but was still critical if there was heavy seas. And there were very heavy seas that night as they were crossing in that late September storm. This was another one that sank in less than an hour, so it sank so quickly. It was at about 1:10 in the morning that they realized that something was wrong with the ship, and so there was no way to rescue so many of the people. Many ships came to help, but the waves were so high it was almost impossible. So again, speed is sometimes of the essence, and that's why in the SOLAS rules, they time us. For example, when they call a crew drill, they time the number of minutes it takes until everyone is in position at their stations. Now, the technology was better on this ship, and one of the reasons was because of one that had sunk just a couple of years early, the Herald of Free Enterprise, which was an incredibly poorly run. There were so many people responsible for this sinking. This was entirely caused by human error. No one bothered to check to make sure this roll-on, roll-off mechanism at the front, the bow visor it's called, was latched properly. And when it sunk in 1987, I believe 150 or 200, 150 people died on that one. And so that because of that one and because of the Estonia in the Western world, in sort of countries that follow all SOLAS rules, we've gotten much, much better at making sure these ferries are a little bit more secure. Now, the greatest actual disaster, I kept using the word peacetime before because the greatest disaster came during the Second World War, and it involved this ship, the Wilhelm Gustloff. This is a really interesting ship. It was to be the flagship of the Strength Through Joy program in Nazi Germany. It was actually supposed to be named the Adolf Hitler. The dimensions of the ship are almost exactly the same as ours, but it could take easily 1,500 passengers on it because their quarters weren't quite the same as on this ship. Anyways, it was being built and it was supposed to be named the Adolf Hitler, and the leader of the Nazi party in Switzerland was assassinated, and Hitler went to his funeral and sat beside his widow, and the man of the name that was assassinated was Wilhelm Gustloff, and so Hitler decided to rename the ship in his honor instead. So it was used for the Strength and Joy program for a couple of years when it was launched in 1937, and then during wartime it was used as a floating hospital ship and also a troop carrier. Now, at the end of January of 1945, as from the east, the Soviet forces are retaking a lot of territory, they started to evacuate German-speaking people from what is now Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Kaliningrad, that little exclave of Russia. So they loaded on a lot of troops, but a lot of civilians onto this boat as well. Now, when it left, it was supposed to have 3 support ships with it to keep an eye out for submarines. 2 of them were not able to get underway, so it only had 1 small support ship on it. And on the evening, late afternoon of the 30th, S-13, a Soviet sub, spotted it and tracked it for a few hours until it had the proper sort of nighttime conditions to be able to attack. It fired 4 torpedoes at this very overcrowded ship that, again, had no markings of being any kind of civilian ship on it. After the war, of course, this was done by the people that won the war, but an investigation was done, and it was determined because there was military troops on board, there was anti-aircraft equipment on the bow and near the stern, and there was no marking saying it was a civilian or a hospital ship, that it was not considered a war crime. Almost 9,500 people died that night. It actually was the son of a survivor in the 1980s who did probably the most exhaustive research of determining exactly how many people were on the ship. The air temperature was minus 15 degrees Celsius. The sea temperature was about 4 degrees. They weren't able to launch most of the life rafts because the rigging was just simply frozen. They couldn't get anything to move. Now, interestingly enough, S-13 as well, just 11 days later, sunk another ship doing the exact same thing as the Gustloff, the General von Steuben, and 4,500 people died in that attack as well. But unfortunately, the captain of the S-13 did not endear himself to his communist overlords after the war, and his name was more or less purged from the records until Russia became an independent country, and that's when it honored this person who they felt had made a contribution to their war effort. And to this day, this remains the single greatest tragedy at sea ever. Then very briefly into the 21st century, we're basically mostly, I know there's one ship out there which I'm not going to talk about tonight, but we're mostly talking about ships that are not following SOLAS rules as well, like La Julia, which went between Senegal and Gambia, and it sunk in 2002 with almost 1,800 dead. This is another one from the Red Sea. 1,500 people died when this one sunk, and the Spice Islands are between Zanzibar and the Tanzanian mainland, sunk in 2011 with 1,000 people. But what the tragedy is these days when it comes to loss of life at sea, of course, is migrants. Migrants in the English Channel, but particularly in the Mediterranean, desperately trying to seek a better economic, political, or social life for themselves and their families. And it's estimated in the last just over decade, about 28,000 people have died just in the Mediterranean, with about 500 more dying in the English Channel. So let's try to bring it up a little bit here. Let's get the party, So we're going to talk about a couple of rescues here to show you that it's not all bleak. This is the Prinsendam. The Prinsendam was a Dutch ship that was sailing from Vancouver, the nice big route over to Tokyo in Japan in 1980. It also caught fire like some of the other examples we saw, but the crew did everything they were supposed to do. They followed all the rules. They had all of their training in place. They were able to make the distress call. The ship did eventually sink, but both the U.S. military, U.S. Coast Guard, and Canadian Coast Guard were all able to respond while the crew kept the fire under control. And of the 520 people on board, crew and passengers, all 520 were rescued. So when we do something right, yay. Now it gets even better, and this is an amazing, amazing story. If you haven't heard of this one before, the Pendleton was called a T2 tanker, one of many that was built in World War II, and then was transformed to carry civilian cargo, civilian liquid products after World War II. So in February of 1952, it's sailing off the coast of Massachusetts, actually a bit south in Nantucket Sound, when it breaks into two. Believe it or not, that very same night, the Fort Mercer, another T2 tanker sailing off Cape Cod, broke into two. Like, what were the odds? Two on the very same night. The Mercer broke into two first, and so it was responded to by most of the Coast Guard in the area. So when the emergency distress call came in that the Pendleton had broken into two, there was very little resources to help it. The bow half, which was found a few days later, of course had no power in it because the engines had the power and they were at the stern. And there were 8 people, including the captain, in the bow section. They all perished mostly from hypothermia. But the ones in the stern, because they had power, they were able to keep the ship afloat for a while. They had a little bit of electricity, and they also had radio communication. So they were able to make an emergency call. Now, the only vessel that was able to answer that call was this 36-foot-long Coast Guard ship from Chatham, which is at the very southern part of Cape Cod. It went out with a crew of 4, Coxswain Weber and his crew of 3 men, into waves that were bigger than the ship itself. So some of the waves were over 40 feet tall, and especially there's the sandbar that separates Chatham from the open ocean that they kind of had to motor their way through that almost took their lives. They were able to make it to the stern half of the Pendleton. They were able to rescue 32 of the 33 men that were in the stern section. The only man that wasn't rescued was the cook, and it's only because as he was coming down the Jacob's ladder that they had set up, a wave came up and he was unfortunately crushed between the ship and the rescue ship itself. The 4 people, like I said, were on that Coast Guard ship. It was rated for a maximum of 19 people. So with the 4 plus 32, they made it back through those same waves and got everyone safely back. At the end, it's been called by the Coast Guard the greatest small boat rescue in not just their history, but in history as far as they're concerned. Normally, when a Coast Guard ship like this does something really well, the coxswain on behalf of the crew is awarded a medal. In this case, all 4 members were awarded the Gold Life-Saving Medal from the U.S. Coast Guard. There was a wonderful book made about it, and a not too bad movie called The Finest Hours. It's on Disney Plus if you want to check that out. Not as good as watching The Perfect Storm. That's what I kept thinking as I was watching it. This isn't quite The Perfect Storm, but it was still a pretty good movie and a great example of some amazing heroism. Now, the rescue that I don't want to say I enjoy the most, because that doesn't sound very good, but I was always the most interested in was after I first developed my interest in the Titanic, I started to look out for other ones, and I came across this one, the Andrea Doria. Many people know about this ship. It was the pride of Italy. So, of course, Italy being defeated in World War II, its navy was down to 2 ships. Its merchant marine was decimated. This is one of the ships that were built afterwards. Didn't go for any speed records, didn't go for size records, but they went for elegance records. This was a floating palace. It was a beautiful, beautiful ship, and it was really the pride of the entire nation. So it was making its way from Italy and France over to New York in July of 1956 when it came across another ship, the Stockholm, which had left New York and was on its way up into the Baltic Sea. Now, I just a couple weeks ago listened to another podcast about this, and it was not very favorable to the third mate who was in charge of the bridge at the time, because this happened in the middle of the night. The captain was off duty. I believe, from what I've read and from what I've heard, I have to go with more. It was the fault of the Stockholm, but it would take too long to explain all that. But basically what happened is the Stockholm was kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Andrea Dory was trying to make a proper turn to pass properly. The Stockholm, for some reason, made the same kind of turn, just like with the Storstad, that ship that hit the Empress of Ireland. It had a very nice reinforced bow, and so it rammed into the side of the Andrea Dory right about in midship. It T-boned it. The Andrea Dory very quickly keeled to its side, which made it, of course, impossible to lower any of the lifeboats from the other side of the ship, and also made it difficult to lower them from the side that was close to the water because of the difficultiness of lowering them. But according to all reports, the crew was very well trained, responded very, very well. They were able to save 1,660 people out of a total of 1,706. And in fact, those 46 people that did die, they all died in the collision because they were in the cabins where the two ships collided. So no lives were lost in the actual rescue mission, but they were tragically lost beforehand. I believe it was 5 members, all crewmen on the Stockholm who happened to be up near the bow at the time, were also killed. But one of the things that fascinated me with this story was some of the heroisms that happened, but some of the almost like miracles, you could call them, that happened, including the case of Linda Morgan. So Linda Morgan was traveling with her mom, her stepmother, and her half-sister. They were in 2 adjoining cabins, and they were right where the ship hit. Linda Morgan's dad, his name was Edward Morgan. He was a very well-respected journalist on ABC Radio in New York. So when he received the news about the shipwreck and he was about to go on air with the information, he also received the news that his daughter was missing and presumed dead in the accident. He kept his composure throughout the radio broadcast. He didn't mention his daughter at all. He kept that information to himself. And then they found her on the Stockholm. So when the Stockholm pulled away, she was on top of the Stockholm. Crew members of the Stockholm found her. All she had basically was a broken arm and a lot of confusion as to where she was and what had happened. It wasn't until the ship was making its way back, the Stockholm, that through all the confusion and manifest lists and everything, that her dad found out that she was alive. Now that, when he made that broadcast, his voice was not nearly as strong. It was much more quavering. She's alive to this day. She lives in San Antonio, Texas. Her husband was once the mayor of San Antonio. She had a lot of survivor's guilt. Her mother did survive as well, but was very seriously injured. Her stepfather and her half-sister both perished in it. But just to me, an absolutely incredible story. So finishing now, like I said, positive stats. So we've got the International Marine Organization, part of the United Nations, which administers the SOLAS agreement. The last SOLAS agreement that we all use today was a big one that was ratified in the 1970s, but it's a constantly evolving document. Anytime there's any kind of incident at sea, the folks at the IMO review it and make changes to SOLAS as necessary. One of the most important chapters is Chapter 5. I think I mentioned at the beginning that the SOLAS has been ratified by 167 nations. And most of those that haven't ratified it are landlocked nations that don't need to. But some nations even have Chapter 5 in their constitutions. 99% of ships that are at sea are generally agreed to follow SOLAS rules. And almost always these days, when an accident happens, it's because a ship was not following the rules. In the United States right now, the most recent stats from the last decade is by far most of the people that perish in marine accidents perish in recreational vehicles. And a lot of times it's people that are not wearing life jackets when they're in things like canoes and stuff like that. That's the most common thing. And the other deaths are almost always doing with passenger vessels, and it's often because the rules are a little more lax sometimes, because sometimes you see those ferries, right? It's just sort of like they're like on a bus, but it still is a marine vessel, and we have to take this seriously. So just to leave you with the stats, and this is from the National Transportation Board in the United States, so the chance of getting a serious injury or death in a car accident is about 1 in 93. The chance of getting into any kind of accident or death in an airplane is under 1 in a million. And the chance of a serious accident or death in a cruise ship is about 1 in 6 million. So you've made the right choice by traveling by cruise ship. Doing pretty good by doing that. So clap for yourselves. Good choice. So it's a fascinating talk. I know it's a little macabre, and I was just reading the other day, too, of an article in the New York Times about children who are really interested in the Titanic and really interested in shipwrecks. And some psychologists believe that it's a way for kids to start to process the idea of death, about how death works, because it's such an unbelievable topic for a young person. And maybe that's what it was for me that led me to this sort of lifelong fascination with these amazing stories of sadness, but also success when it comes to the high seas. I'm almost out of time. Fortunately, I don't have time for questions, but I'm down here if you have any questions or hopefully a happy story, not a sad story you want to share with me. If you're still interested in hearing some chatting, Jessie is up in the hide in 10 minutes. She's going to be talking about the study of whales using whale bones. And of course, if you love the Mississippi River, there's a BBC documentary starting here in 10 minutes as well. Folks, thank you for joining me. Tonight, you're setting your phone 1 hour back. The best way to do this, because your phones are going to be all over the map tomorrow morning, is turn on your TV when you get up. Whatever time you see on the TV, that's what time it is, all right? Have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.